Rosa Boone would later say it was the silence that warned her first, not the smell, not the strange film upon the water, but the terrible quiet of a Wyoming morning when even the meadowlarks refused to sing near the well behind the bunkhouse. That morning came in the third week of August, in the year 1883, after a summer so dry that the grama grass had turned the color of old bone, and the cattle had grown thin enough that Cyrus Donovan could count their ribs from horseback at 100 paces. But to understand how Rosa Boone came to be standing at that well at first light, with her shawl clutched to her throat and her heart hammering as though it meant to break free of her chest, one must go back to the spring of that same year, to the day she stepped off the stagecoach in the dust and wind of Cedar Bend, Wyoming territory, a schoolteacher from St. Louis who had never in her life branded a calf or drawn water from a well that might kill her. She had answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial News, a newspaper her landlady kept folded on the parlor table alongside seed catalogs and copies of Godey's Lady's Book. The advertisement had been plain enough, written in a hand she would later come to know as careful and slow, the hand of a man more comfortable with a branding iron than a pen. Rancher, widower, 33 years of age, seeks a wife of good character and sound constitution, willing to work, willing to learn, willing to love. Land is good, water is good, heart is willing. Cyrus Donovan, Cedar Bend, Wyoming territory. Rosa had read those words perhaps a dozen times before she wrote back. Her own father had died the winter before, and the family farm outside St. Louis had gone to auction after 2 years of drought, and a mortgage her father had never spoken of until it was too late to save. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and increasingly aware that the schoolhouse where she taught paid her barely enough to keep a room and board, let alone build a future. She was not a woman given to romantic fancies, or so she told herself on the long train ride west, and then the longer, rougher stagecoach ride that followed, jostling her bones and coating her traveling dress in a fine yellow dust that would not wash out no matter how she scrubbed it. Cyrus Donovan met her at the stage depot in Cedar Bend on a Tuesday in April, standing beside a buckboard wagon with his hat in his hands, and Rosa's first thought upon seeing him was that he looked like a man who had forgotten how to smile and was trying very hard to remember. "Miss Boone," he had said, and his voice was low and rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel. "I hope the journey was not too hard on you." "It was hard enough," she had answered honestly, for she was not a woman who believed in polite lies, even to strangers she meant to marry. "But I am here, Mr. Donovan, and I intend to see it through." He had studied her for a long moment then, his eyes the gray-blue of a Wyoming sky before a storm, and something in his face had eased, just slightly, as though her plain honesty had told him more about her character than any letter could have. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who came through Cedar Bend once a month, in the front room of the Donovan Ranch house with old Pete Whitfield and the ranch hand standing witness, their hats over their hearts, and a young cowhand named Tom Riley weeping without shame because, as he explained afterward, he had not seen a wedding since his own sister's, back in Missouri, and it put him in a sentimental humor. It was not in those early weeks a marriage built on love, not the kind the dime novels promised. Cyrus was a man of few words, still carrying the grief of his first wife Mary, who had died of scarlet fever 2 summers past, leaving him alone on nearly 4,000 acres of rangeland with 300 head of cattle and a house that echoed with silence. Rosa understood grief. She had buried her own mother as a girl and her father more recently, and she did not ask Cyrus to speak of Mary before he was ready. Instead, she set about learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination she had once brought to teaching unruly schoolchildren their letters. She learned to bake bread in the wood stove without burning it. She learned to mend fence alongside old Pete when the men were short-handed. She learned the names of every hand on the ranch, from grizzled Pete Whitfield, who had ridden with Cyrus's father before him, to young Tom Riley, barely 19 and homesick, to the quiet Mexican vaquero named Joaquin who taught her to sit a horse properly instead of clinging to it like a burr. She learned, too, the particular quality of the silence between herself and her husband, and how it was not the silence of unhappiness, but the silence of two people circling each other carefully, each afraid to hope for too much. It was old Pete who first told her about the trouble with Silas Grady. "Man's got the biggest spread this side of the Sweetwater," Pete said one evening in June, as they sat on the porch while the sun bled orange and red across the western hills. "Ran 2,000 head onto the open range this spring, more than the grass can bear, and now with the drought settling in the way it has, he's looking hungry at every water source for 20 miles, including ours." "Ours is a well," Rosa said. "Surely he cannot lay claim to a well dug on Donovan land." "No," Pete agreed, working a piece of grass between his teeth. "But a man like Grady don't need a legal claim to make trouble. He's got money enough to buy a judge if it comes to that, and men enough to make life hard for a smaller outfit in the meantime. Cyrus's daddy and Grady's daddy fought over this very same water 30 years back. Some feuds don't die easy. They just wait for a drought to wake them up again." Rosa had filed this information away, the way she filed away most things, quietly, watchfully, the schoolteacher's habit of observing before speaking. She noticed in the weeks that followed how Cyrus's jaw tightened whenever Grady's name came up in town, how he took to riding the fence line near the northern boundary more often than seemed necessary, how he began sleeping with his rifle propped near the bedroom door instead of in the gun cabinet in the front room. She noticed, too, other things, smaller things, things that had nothing to do with Silas Grady and everything to do with the man she had married. She noticed how Cyrus always gave her the first cup of coffee from the pot, still scalding hot, before pouring his own. She noticed how he had built her a small writing desk from scrap lumber without being asked, setting it beneath the window in their bedroom where the morning light was best, because she had once mentioned, only once, that she missed having a place to write letters. She noticed how, when a rattlesnake startled her horse during a ride along the creek in July, Cyrus had been at her side before she had even finished crying out, pulling her down from the spooked animal and holding her against his chest with a fierceness that surprised them both. "You are shaking," he had said that day, his arms still around her, his breath warm against her hair. "I am fine," she had answered, though her voice betrayed her. "It only startled me. You could have been thrown, you could have been bitten." His voice had cracked slightly on the last word, and Rosa had looked up to see something raw and unguarded in his face, something that looked very much like fear, and beneath the fear something else entirely. "Cyrus," she had said softly, using his given name for perhaps the third time since their marriage. He had not answered with words. He had simply held her a moment longer before releasing her, clearing his throat, and remarking gruffly that they had best get back before Pete sent out a search party. But Rosa had carried the memory of his arms around her for days afterward, turning it over like a smooth stone in her pocket, and she began to understand that whatever this marriage was, whatever it had begun as, it was becoming something else entirely. By August, the drought had tightened its grip on the whole territory like a fist. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Donovan land had shrunk to a trickle of brown water threading through cracked mud. The grass, what remained of it, crunched underfoot like dry paper. Cattle grew gaunt and restless, bawling for water that grew scarcer by the day, and every rancher within 50 miles watched the sky for rain clouds that refused to come. The well behind the bunkhouse, dug deep into the earth by Cyrus's father 20 years before, had become the most precious thing on the ranch, more valuable than gold, more valuable than the cattle themselves, for without water there would be no cattle at all, and without cattle there would be no ranch, no home, no future for any of them. It was against this backdrop of drought and desperation that Rosa Boone rose before dawn on that fateful morning in the third week of August, unable to sleep, her mind troubled by dreams she could not quite remember, and walked out onto the porch in her nightdress and shawl to watch the sun climb over the eastern hills. The silence struck her immediately, though she could not have said why at first. Wyoming mornings were rarely silent. There were always sounds: the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the chatter of meadowlarks, and the harsh cry of a hawk somewhere overhead. But this morning, as Rosa stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself against the pre-dawn chill, she heard nothing at all, and the nothing pressed against her ears like a physical weight. She told herself it was only her imagination, the residue of unsettling dreams, but something drew her off the porch and across the yard toward the well, some instinct she could not name, the same instinct perhaps that had once told her a favorite pupil back in St. Louis was falling ill days before the fever showed itself, or that a summer storm was coming long before the clouds gathered. The well stood in its familiar spot behind the bunkhouse, a stone-lined pit topped with a wooden frame and pulley, a bucket hanging on its rope. As Rosa approached, she saw the ranch dog, a rangy blue heeler named Scout, lying near the well's base, and something in the animal's posture made her breath catch. Scout was not sleeping. Scout was lying too still, his sides barely rising and falling, a thin trail of foam at the corner of his mouth. "Scout," Rosa breathed, dropping to her knees beside the dog, her hands searching his fur for some sign of injury, some explanation. The dog's eyes rolled toward her, glassy and unfocused, and a tremor ran through his hindquarters. It was then that she noticed the water. The bucket had been left resting on the well's stone rim, perhaps from the previous evening's chores, and a small pool of water had collected in the depression of the wood beside it, evaporating slowly in the summer heat. But the water was wrong. It carried a faint sheen upon its surface, an iridescence that had no business in clean well water, and around its edges where it had dried, there remained a fine white crust, almost like frost, though the morning was already warm. Rosa had grown up on a farm. She knew the look of alkali dust, the white crust that sometimes formed on poor soil, and this was not that. This crust had a strange, unnatural regularity to it, a crystalline structure that caught the early light in a way that made her stomach clench with sudden, nameless dread. She rose and looked into the well itself, and though the water below was too deep and dark to see clearly, she caught, or thought she caught, the faintest odor rising from the depths, something bitter and metallic beneath the mineral smell of stone and earth, a smell she could not place but that raised the hair on her arms all the same. Behind her, the bunkhouse door creaked open, and Tom Riley stumbled out, rubbing sleep from his eyes, heading toward the well with the easy unconcern of a young man beginning his morning chores. He carried an empty tin cup in one hand, clearly intending to draw water for his morning coffee before the others rose. "Tom, no." Rosa's voice tore out of her before she had fully decided to speak, sharp and commanding in a way that startled even herself. "Do not touch that water." Tom froze, cup halfway raised, staring at her with wide, confused eyes. "Mrs. Donovan, what's the matter?" "Look at Scout," she said, pointing to the stricken dog, her voice shaking now that the urgency of the moment had passed and the fear was catching up with her. "Look at him, Tom. Something is wrong with this water. Something is very wrong." Tom's gaze followed her pointing finger to the dog, and his young face went pale as understanding dawned. He set the tin cup down on the stone rim as though it had suddenly grown too hot to hold. "Lord Almighty," he whispered. "Is he going to die?" "I do not know," Rosa said, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way she had learned to do in a one-room schoolhouse full of children who might, at any moment, do something dangerous without warning. "Go wake Mr. Donovan. Now, Tom, run." Tom ran. Rosa remained beside the dog, murmuring soft, useless comfort, stroking his heaving side, while behind her the ranch began to stir with the sounds of alarm, boots pounding across hard-packed earth, voices calling out questions that had no answers yet. Cyrus Donovan arrived at a dead run, his shirt only half-buttoned, his hair uncombed, his eyes wild with a fear Rosa had not seen in him since the day of the rattlesnake. He dropped to his knees on the other side of the stricken dog, his big hands moving over the animal's body with a gentleness that belied his size. What happened? He demanded, though his tone held no accusation, only desperate need to understand. I found him like this, Rosa said. And the water, Cyrus, look at the water. There is something in it, some kind of poison, I think. Cyrus's head snapped up, his gaze following hers to the strange sheen and crystalline crust upon the wooden rim of the well. For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw working, and Rosa watched the full weight of understanding settle over him like a physical burden. If the well was poisoned, if the only water source for the ranch and its animals and its people was tainted, they stood on the edge of a catastrophe far greater than drought alone. Nobody drinks from this well, Cyrus said, his voice carrying across the yard where the ranch hands had gathered, roused by the commotion, still buttoning shirts and pulling on boots. Nobody. Not the men, not the horses, not the cattle. Pete, get every man moving the herd toward the creek, what's left of it, and keep them there until we know what in God's name has happened here. Old Pete, already grasping the gravity of the situation, began barking orders, and the yard erupted into purposeful chaos as ranch hands scrambled toward the corrals and pastures, driving thirsty cattle away from the well's radius, herding horses toward the diminished creek that, brown and shallow as it was, remained at least uncontaminated. Rosa remained kneeling beside Scout, and it was Doc Hendricks, summoned within the hour by a rider sent at a gallop to Cedar Bend, who confirmed what she had already suspected in her bones. Strychnine most likely, the doctor said, examining the crystalline residue Cyrus had carefully scraped from the well's rim into a tin cup, wrapped in a handkerchief to protect his own hands. Or something very like it, used most often for wolves and coyotes, but a man could just as easily use it to poison a well if he had enough of it and no conscience to speak of. He looked up, his weathered face grim. You are fortunate, Mrs. Donovan, fortunate beyond telling. Another hour, and half this ranch would have been drawing water from that well for breakfast. Will Scout live? Rosa asked, for the dog remained the immediate concern, whimpering weakly as the doctor examined him. He got into it early, and in small amount, licking at the spill rather than drinking deep. I'd wager, or he'd already be dead, Doc Hendricks said. I have brought what I can. We shall see. He administered what treatment he could, a mixture of activated charcoal mixed into water and forced down the dog's throat, and instructed that Scout be kept warm and watched closely through the coming hours. It was Cyrus who finally voiced the question that hung over the yard like a storm cloud. Who would do such a thing? The answer, though none dared speak it aloud at first, hung in the air between them all, a name too dangerous to say without evidence. Silas Grady. That evening, after the immediate crisis had settled into the tense, watchful quiet of a household bracing for further trouble, Rosa and Cyrus sat together on the porch steps, closer than they had ever sat before, their shoulders nearly touching in the cooling dusk air. You saved lives today, Cyrus said quietly, not looking at her but out at the darkening yard, where lanterns had been lit near the well to keep any curious animal or careless hand from approaching it in the night. If you had not gone out this morning, if you had not noticed Scout, if you had not stopped Tom before he drew that water, Rosa, I do not know how many of us would be lying dead or dying right now. I only noticed what was in front of me, Rosa said, though her voice trembled slightly at the memory of how close disaster had come. Anyone might have seen it. No, Cyrus turned to look at her then, and in the fading light his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. Not anyone. You. Your eyes, your instincts, your courage to act on a hunch that most would have dismissed as foolishness. Rosa, I have watched you these past months, watched you learn a life that was not born to you, watched you work harder than any woman I have ever known, and I have been. He paused, searching for words that did not come easily to a man who had spent 2 years locking his heart away from further grief. I have been a fool not to tell you sooner what has grown in my heart. Rosa's pulse quickened, her hands trembling in her lap. Cyrus, what are you saying? I am saying that I did not marry you for convenience alone, though God knows that is how it began, he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am saying that somewhere in these months of watching you mend fences and bake bread and learn to sit a horse despite your fear, somewhere in the sound of your voice reading letters aloud by lamplight, I fell in love with you, Rosa Boone. Truly and completely. And today, when I saw you kneeling beside that well, when I understood how close we had all come to losing everything, all I could think was that I could not bear to lose you too." Tears rose unbidden to Rosa's eyes, and she did not try to stop them. "I have loved you for weeks now, Cyrus Donovan," she confessed, her voice breaking on his name. "I did not know how to tell you for fear that what began as an arrangement could never truly become a marriage of the heart, but it has. It has become exactly that." Cyrus's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers closing around her own with a gentleness that spoke louder than any words. For a long moment they simply sat together, hand in hand, the weight of the day's terror giving way to something warmer, something that had been growing quietly between them since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach in April. "We will find who did this," Cyrus said finally, his voice hardening with resolve even as his hand remained gentle around hers. "And when we do, they will answer for it, before God and before the law." The following days brought a flurry of activity to Donovan Ranch, though the immediate danger had passed. Cyrus rode into Cedar Bend himself to fetch the sheriff, a weathered lawman named Wyatt Combs who had kept the peace in the territory for the better part of a decade, and who arrived within the day to examine the well and the surrounding ground with a careful, practiced eye. "Someone was here in the night," Sheriff Combs announced after nearly an hour of study, crouching near the well's base to examine the hard-packed earth. "See here, boot prints, though the ground's too dry to hold them clear. And this." He held up a small burlap sack, torn and empty, that had been tossed carelessly into the brush a short distance from the well, as though the perpetrator had not troubled himself to hide his tracks thoroughly, perhaps trusting in the drought and darkness to cover his crime. Rosa, standing nearby with Cyrus, felt her stomach turn as she examined the sack. Stitched into its rough fabric, nearly worn away but still faintly legible, was a brand mark she had seen before, on cattle driven past the northern boundary of Donovan land not 2 weeks earlier. A circle with a jagged line through its center. The Grady brand. "That settles it," Cyrus said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Grady means to poison us out of house and land rather than pay fair market price for water rights he has no claim to." "Settles nothing in a court of law," Sheriff Combs cautioned, though his own expression suggested he shared Cyrus's suspicion entirely. "A torn sack with a faded brand ain't proof enough to hang a man, nor even arrest him proper, not without more. Grady's got money enough to hire a lawyer who'd tear that evidence to shreds inside a minute. We need more than a sack, Cyrus. We need a witness, or a confession, or Grady's own poison found in his possession." It was Rosa who suggested, 2 evenings later, as they sat around the kitchen table poring over the problem with Old Pete and Sheriff Combs, that they might find such a witness among Grady's own hired men, for even the most loyal cowhand might balk at murder, however it was dressed up as mere trespass or land dispute. "There's a young hand rides for Grady," Old Pete said slowly, considering. "Feller named Buck Sorrel. Not a bad sort from what I hear, just fell in with a rough outfit for lack of better prospects. I've seen him in town of an evening, drinking alone, looking troubled about something. Might be the poisoning weighs on him." It was decided, after considerable debate, that Cyrus himself would ride into Cedar Bend the following evening and seek out this Buck Sorrel at the saloon, to see whether conscience might succeed where evidence had failed. Rosa insisted on accompanying him, over his initial objections. "This is no place for a woman, Rosa. A saloon at night, with Grady's men like as not drinking there too," Cyrus protested as they prepared the wagon. "I did not marry a coward, Cyrus Donovan, and I will not become one myself by hiding at home while my husband walks into danger," Rosa replied, climbing onto the wagon seat with a determination that brooked no argument. "Besides, A young man troubled in conscience may speak more freely to a woman who shows him kindness than to another man who might remind him of his own hard employer. Cyrus, recognizing the truth in her words and perhaps recognizing too that arguing with Rosa Boone was an exercise in futility once her mind was set, said nothing further, only helped her up onto the wagon seat and drove them into town beneath a sky brilliant with more stars than Rosa had ever seen back in St. Louis, the Wyoming night vast and silent around them. Cedar Bend's saloon, the Silver Spur, was a modest establishment by any Eastern standard, a single long room with a bar of rough-hewn pine and a scattering of tables where cowhands from every ranch in the territory gathered of an evening to drink cheap whiskey and trade news and gossip. Rosa waited outside in the wagon while Cyrus went in first, scanning the room for the young man Pete had described, and found him easily enough. A lanky youth of perhaps 20 years sitting alone at a corner table, staring into an untouched glass of whiskey as though it held answers he could not find elsewhere. Cyrus approached carefully, mindful of the several Grady hands scattered about the room who eyed him with open hostility the moment they recognized the Donovan name. "Buck Sorrel," Cyrus said quietly, taking the seat across from the young man without waiting for invitation. Buck looked up startled, his young face pale beneath a sunburn that spoke of long days in the saddle. "Mr. Donovan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I reckon I know why you're here." "Do you?" Cyrus said, watching him carefully. Buck's hands trembled around his whiskey glass. "I ain't slept proper in 3 nights," he confessed suddenly, the words tumbling out as though a dam had broken within him. "Grady sent me and 2 other hands out that night, told us to poison your well, said it weren't nothing but a way to force you off land that ought to belong to him by rights. Said you Donovans had been squatting on water that his daddy discovered 30 years back." He shook his head, misery written plain across his features. "I didn't want no part of it, Mr. Donovan. I swear it before God, but Grady pays well and threatens worse for them as cross him. And I'm the only one in my family bringing home wages this year, with my mother sick back in Cheyenne and my little brothers depending on what I send home." "Nobody died, Buck," Cyrus said, his voice hard but not unkind, for he could see the young man was genuinely tormented by what he had done. "But it was a near thing. My wife found the dog before it could kill him and stopped one of my hands from drinking that water himself. If she had not, Buck, you would be sitting here right now as good as a murderer." Buck's face went ashen. "I know it," he whispered. "I've known it every hour since, and it's eaten at me something terrible. I only agreed because I was afraid, but that's no excuse before God or man, is it?" "No," Cyrus agreed. "It is not, but there is a way to begin setting it right. Come with me to the sheriff, tell him what you have told me, and testify against Grady when the time comes. It will not undo what was nearly done, but it will stop worse from happening to my family or to anyone else Grady decides stands between him and what he wants." Buck sat in agonized silence for a long moment, and Rosa, watching from the wagon window through the saloon's dusty glass, held her breath as though she could somehow influence the outcome through sheer force of hope. Finally Buck nodded, his young shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and dread. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Mr. Donovan, I'll tell the sheriff everything. I only pray it don't get me killed for the telling." "Sheriff Combs will see you're protected," Cyrus assured him, though his own expression suggested he understood the danger Buck was courting by turning against a man as powerful and vindictive as Silas Grady. "You're doing the right thing, Buck. That counts for something, whatever comes after." They rode together to the sheriff's office that same night, Buck Sorrel trembling but resolute, and gave his full confession to Sheriff Combs, who listened with grim satisfaction and immediately began preparing the paperwork necessary to secure a warrant for Silas Grady's arrest. "This'll go easier with a signed confession from one of his own men," the sheriff said. "But Grady won't go quiet, mark my words. Man's got pride enough for 3 men and a temper to match. I'll want deputies riding with me when we serve this warrant, and I'd ask you to stay well clear of it, Cyrus, much as I understand you're wanting a hand in seeing justice done." Cyrus was not a man inclined to sit idle while others settled matters that touched his own family and land so directly. But he recognized the wisdom in the sheriff's caution, and reluctantly agreed to remain at the ranch, while Sheriff Combs and two deputies rode out to the Grady spread the following morning to serve the warrant. The morning of the arrest brought its own tension to Donovan Ranch, for word had spread quickly through the territory, as word always did in a land where every rancher in hand knew every other rancher in hand within 50 miles, and there was genuine fear that Grady might resist arrest violently, that blood might yet be spilled before the matter was settled. Rosa spent the morning unable to concentrate on any task, her hands trembling as she attempted to knead bread dough, her ears straining for the sound of returning horses that might bring news, good or ill. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of hooves finally reached the ranch house, and Rosa rushed to the porch to see Cyrus's own hired hand, young Tom Riley, who had been sent to Cedar Bend that morning on an errand, and had lingered to learn the outcome, riding hard up the lane with news writ plain across his excited face. "They got him," Tom called out before he had even fully reined in his horse. Sheriff Combs and his deputies rode out to the Grady place this morning, and Grady tried to run for it soon as he saw them coming, tried to make for the hills on his best horse. But the sheriff's deputy is a fine shot and put a bullet through the man's hat brim as warning, and that took the fight clean out of him. "He's sitting in the Cedar Bend jail this very hour, Mrs. Donovan, and word is he's already trying to buy his way free, offering the sheriff more money than most men see in a year. But Sheriff Combs won't hear of it, not with Buck Sorrell's confession signed and witnessed." Rosa felt a wave of relief so profound that her knees nearly gave way beneath her, and she gripped the porch railing to steady herself as Cyrus emerged from the barn at the commotion, his own face lighting with the same relief when he heard Tom's news repeated. "It is over, then," Rosa said softly, as much to herself as to anyone. "Truly over." "The arrest is made," Cyrus said, coming to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that had become natural between them in these past tumultuous days. "The trial will take longer, and Grady's lawyers will fight hard to see him free again. But with Buck's confession, and the evidence found at our well, I do not think even the most determined defense can save him from at least some measure of justice." The trial, when it came in October, proved shorter than anyone had anticipated, for Grady's own arrogance worked against him in the courtroom, his temper flaring at the judge's questions in a manner that did little to endear him to the jury of local ranchers and townsfolk who had, many of them, suffered under his high-handed dealings for years. Buck Sorrell's testimony, given with visible reluctance but unwavering honesty, proved damning, and the physical evidence recovered from the Donovan well, matched conclusively to a larger supply of strychnine found hidden in Grady's own barn, sealed the matter beyond reasonable doubt. Silas Grady was convicted of attempted poisoning and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. His vast landholdings seized to pay restitution to the Donovan family, and settled, in part, upon several smaller ranchers whose water rights he had long bullied and manipulated. Buck Sorrell, in recognition of his cooperation and evident remorse, received only a suspended sentence and a stern warning, and to everyone's quiet surprise, young Cyrus offered him a position as a ranch hand at Donovan Ranch itself once the trial concluded, a gesture of forgiveness that moved the young man nearly to tears. A man who can find his conscience even in a moment of great fear and greater temptation is a man worth a second chance, Cyrus explained to Rosa that evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the last of the autumn light fade over hills now green again, with the first rains the drought-broken sky had finally granted them. Besides, we could use another good hand now that the ranch is growing." "Growing," Rosa repeated, smiling. "You say that as though you already know something the rest of us do not." Cyrus turned to her, and in the gathering dusk his expression held a tenderness that still, even now, months into their marriage, made her heart quicken as though she were a girl of 17 rather than a woman of 26. "I know that I love you, Rosa Boone Donovan," he said, using her full married name deliberately, as he often did now, savoring the sound of it. "I know that this ranch, this land, this life we are building together means nothing without you at the center of it. And I know that whatever comes, drought or flood, poison or plenty, I want to face it standing beside you, for as long as God grants us breath." Rosa's eyes filled with happy tears, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as his arm tightened around her. "Then we shall face it together," she said softly. "Always together." The rains that autumn broke the drought at last, filling the creek once more, greening the range, and allowing the cattle to fatten in preparation for the coming winter. Donovan Ranch prospered in the years that followed, its herds growing, its reputation for fair dealing and hard work spreading throughout the territory, and the well behind the bunkhouse, thoroughly cleaned and tested repeatedly by Doc Hendricks before anyone dared trust it again, became something of a local legend. The well that nearly claimed a ranch full of lives before a schoolteacher's sharp eyes and quick thinking saved them all. Old Pete Whitfield took to telling the story to every new hand who came to work the ranch, embellishing it a little more with each telling, until in his version Rosa had wrestled the poisoned bucket from Tom Riley's very hands and thrown it clear across the yard, a version Rosa always corrected with a laughing shake of her head whenever she overheard it, though she never quite managed to make Pete tell it straight. In the spring of 1884, not quite a year after Rosa had first stepped off the stagecoach in Cedar Bend, a stranger to the West, and to the man she had agreed to marry, she discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the ranch house with a joy so profound that even the normally stoic Cyrus wept openly when she told him, kneeling before her chair and pressing his face against her still flat stomach, as though he could already feel the life growing there. "A child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child, Rosa. After everything, after all we have weathered together, we are to have a child." "God willing, a healthy one," Rosa said, stroking his hair with a tenderness that had grown so natural between them now that she scarcely remembered the awkward strangers who had married in that same front room less than a year before. "Though I confess I am somewhat terrified, Cyrus. I know nothing of raising children on a cattle ranch." "You knew nothing of ranch life at all when you first arrived," Cyrus pointed out, looking up at her with a smile that still, after all these months, had the power to make her breath catch. "And yet you have become the finest rancher's wife in the whole territory, saving a household from poison, standing up to men twice your size, learning to ride and rope and mend fence better than half the hands I employ. I have no doubt whatsoever that you will be a fine mother, Rosa Boone Donovan, whatever fears trouble you now." The child, born in the depths of that winter during a snowstorm so fierce that Doc Hendricks nearly failed to reach the ranch in time, arrived healthy and loud, a boy they named Samuel, after Cyrus's own father. And Rosa's joy in holding her newborn son for the first time was matched only by the fierce protective love she saw kindled in Cyrus's eyes, as he cradled the infant in his large, work-roughened hands, hands that had branded cattle and mended fence, and once gently held a dying dog while his wife's quick thinking saved a ranch full of lives. 2 more children followed in the years that came after, a daughter named Mary Rose, in honor both of Cyrus's first wife and of Rosa's own middle name, born in the spring of 1886, and a second son, William, born in 1888, completing a family that filled the once quiet ranch house with laughter and noise, and the particular chaos of small children underfoot during branding season. Rosa often thought, in quiet moments during those busy years, of that terrible morning beside the well, of the silence that had drawn her outside before dawn, of Scout's labored breathing and the strange sheen upon poisoned water. And she understood now, with the clarity that only comes with time and distance, that the crisis which had so nearly destroyed everything she and Cyrus were building together had instead become the very foundation upon which their true marriage was built. It was in facing that danger together, in trusting each other completely when everything hung in the balance, that the careful, wary strangers who had married for practical reasons had become, at last, husband and wife in every sense that mattered. Scout, the ranch dog, recovered fully from his exposure to the poison within a fortnight, thanks to Doc Hendrix's prompt treatment, and lived on for many more years afterward, growing into a fat, contented old age spent mostly sleeping in patches of sunlight on the porch, occasionally rousing himself to bark half-heartedly at strangers before returning to his nap, a living testament to the morning. His mistress's sharp instincts had saved his life along with everyone else's. Buck Sorrel proved himself a fine and loyal hand in the years that followed, eventually courting and marrying a young woman from Cedar Bend, the daughter of the town's blacksmith, and Cyrus stood as best man at the wedding, a gesture of friendship and forgiveness that Buck never forgot, often saying in later years that Cyrus Donovan's willingness to give him a second chance had saved him from a life of shame and regret that might otherwise have followed him always. Silas Grady served nearly 12 years of his 15-year sentence before dying of a fever in the territorial prison, unrepentant to the end according to those who visited him, his once vast holdings long since scattered among the smaller ranchers he had spent years trying to bully off their own land. A fitting end, most in the territory agreed, to a man whose greed had nearly cost innocent lives. By the time Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, Donovan Ranch had grown to become one of the most respected cattle operations in the newly formed state, known not only for the quality of its herds, but for the fair and generous treatment of its hands, a reputation that Rosa took quiet pride in having helped shape. For she never forgot her own early days of struggle and uncertainty, and made certain that no hand who worked Donovan land ever went without decent wages or kind treatment. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1893, Cyrus and Rosa sat together on the same porch where he had first confessed his love to her a decade before, now surrounded by the sounds of their 3 children playing in the yard beyond, Samuel nearly 10 years old and already showing his father's gift for horsemanship, Mary Rose 7, and fiercely determined to keep pace with her older brother in every pursuit, and William 5, and full of the particular fearless mischief that seemed to run in Donovan blood. "Do you remember," Rosa said softly, watching her children chase fireflies in the deepening dusk, "how frightened I was, stepping off that stagecoach 10 years ago, not knowing what manner of man I had agreed to marry?" "I remember," Cyrus said, his arms settling around her shoulders in the same gesture that had become as natural to him as breathing over the years of their marriage. "I remember thinking you were the most determined woman I had ever encountered, and being more than a little afraid myself, if I am honest, afraid that I could never make you happy after the grief I still carried for Mary, afraid that our marriage would remain forever a practical arrangement between strangers. And yet here we are," Rosa said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars began to appear overhead, brilliant and countless in the vast Wyoming darkness. "A decade married, 3 beautiful children, a ranch that has weathered drought and poison and the schemes of a greedy man, and a love that has only grown stronger with every trial we have faced together. I would not trade a single day of it," Cyrus said, turning to press a gentle kiss against her temple. "Not the hardship, not the fear, not even that terrible morning beside the well, for it was that very morning, watching you save us all through your courage and quick thinking, that I understood fully what a treasure I had been given in you, Rosa Boone Donovan. You saved this ranch. You saved our family before it had even truly begun, and you have been saving me in 1,000 smaller ways every single day since." Rosa turned her face up to his, and in the gathering starlight, beneath the vast and endless Wyoming sky that had once seemed so foreign and frightening to a schoolteacher fresh from St. Louis, she kissed her husband with all the love that had grown between them across a decade of shared hardship and shared joy. A love that had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers and had blossomed, through trial and triumph alike, into something as deep and enduring as the land itself. Their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, mingling with the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night and the creak of the windmill turning lazily in the gentle wind. Sounds that had once been strange and unfamiliar to Rosa's ears, and had become, over 10 years, the very music of home. The well behind the bunkhouse, cleaned and purified and trusted once more, continued to provide clean water to the ranch and all who called it home. A quiet monument to the morning when a rancher's wife's sharp eyes and swift courage had discovered poison before it could claim a single soul, and had, in the discovering, found not only safety for those she loved, but the true and lasting love of her own heart as well. And so it was that Rosa Boone Donovan and Cyrus Donovan lived out their years upon that Wyoming ranch in a happiness neither had dared hope for in the uncertain days of their arranged marriage. Their love deepened rather than diminished by time, their family flourishing across the changing decades of a territory becoming a state, a wild frontier settling slowly into civilization, and their story, whispered still among the old-timers of Cedar Bend long after both had grown gray and their children had children of their own, remembered always as proof that even a marriage begun in practical necessity might yet bloom into the truest kind of love, forged in the fire of shared danger and tempered by shared devotion, lasting until their final days, hand in hand, upon the porch of the home they had built together from nothing but hard work, courage, and an abiding love that had saved them both.